This video is brought to you by Vixur Shasta's entire past. Seriously, the episode was good otherwise, that's what we're focusing on today. Episode 4 of Sword Art Online Alicization War of Underworld is all about the Dark Territory, its past, its leadership, its goals, and its first step into the future. Gabriel's past was covered extensively, Shasta's past wasn't covered extensively, we had quite the chilling scenes and more. Welcome everyone, it's me Gamerturk, your most reliable source of Sword Art Online information, with Alicization Explained featuring War of Underworld Episode 4, Dark Territory. As always, timestamps to individual plot points are in the description as well as the pinned comment for easy navigation, but to give you a quick rundown, the adaptation quality was almost perfect except for Shasta's backstory being cut, but we have reached a point where the anime kinda reached the limits of what can be done while omitting all the internal monologues. When I was watching the episode, I was thrilled that they were adapting everything in the novels, but felt empty inside and couldn't really put my finger onto it. Nothing was missing content-wise, but the product felt lacking regardless, and well, we'll talk about that in a bit. But if you're new to my Explain series, what I do here is essentially provide you all the vital information on characters, events, action, lore from the source material, light novels, things that the anime did not convey properly or just did not have the time to, so you can still see the full picture. So make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon to not miss any of the details in the upcoming weeks, and gain an immunity shield against the pawns of Emperor Vecta swiftly spreading misinformation and uncontrolled spoilers like a pack of foxes. But then again, if you want to read the books for yourselves for the amazing experience, Amazon and Book Depository affiliate links are in the description and the knowledge of Stacia awaits you there. Let's start with the detailed summary and the reason why the episode lacked so much impact than what it was meant to be. I also can imagine anime-only audience finding the episode very impactful, don't get me wrong, and I do understand where you are coming from with all the dramatic and shocking moments featured in the episode, but I hope you're willing to hear me out in regards to what the episode should have been instead. To start with, the episode has covered Volume 15 Alicization Invading's Chapter 17 from Part 2 all the way to the end of Part 4, with a little bit of Part 3 being cut that will be shifted over to the next week to maintain a proper narrative thread, so all in all about 50 pages, pretty much the ceiling limit page count for an accurate adaptation. You can say about 60 pages if we include Alicia's stuff as well, so props to the anime for including so many great details as it did. But now, before we enter the actual contents, I'll tell you exactly what is missing that's causing such a tonal shift in the episode. Chapter 17's Dark Territory parts are designed as a, let's say, quote-unquote torture sessions for the viewer, or rather the reader. There is not much of a shock factor going on in the novels as you have seen in the anime. When you see Alicia getting injected, Lipia getting killed, Shasta going berserk, the novel is not designed to shock or surprise you with these grand moments because it makes it very clear these are coming, and that's the reason I define these chapters as quote-unquote torture. The novel makes you know a disaster is just around the corner constantly, but lets you keep living the immense tension building up inside the Obsidia Palace until all hell breaks loose. For 60 to 70 pages, including the final contents of the previous episode, the entire content is about how Shasta faced so many difficulties in his past to thrive them all, and with a major disaster around the corner, how much of it can he thrive with his actions? And you simply live through that journey without knowing it because the characters themselves, none of the characters themselves know how things are going to play out. Not even Gabriel himself. And that takes me to the main point here. If you look at the afterword of Volume 16, Alicization Exploding, Reki highlights that he has designed War of Underworld narrative differently for a reason, switching from a third-person limited perspective, as in we only know the inner thoughts of Kirito and Yujiro only, to a third-person omniscient perspective where we experience more or less everybody's thoughts. And that's where the anime, dedicated to skip all inner monologues, is doomed to fail. The impact of the story, the narrative, is designed around the fact that you should be knowing and experiencing what these characters are experiencing. And when the anime simply commits to providing a camera for the audience to look into the world but no ears to actually listen, resulting the audience to only see what is playing off on the screen rather than the actual context of what is happening and why characters are doing what they do, it just doesn't work. When you learn Lipia was not ordered to kill Vecta by Shasta, but did her out of her own volition, not just for herself, but for the future of the orphanage she was running, taking care of infants in the Dark Territory. Fusa immediately shutting down Shasta hits much harder when you learn he is not trying to protect Vecta, but rather trying to exact vengeance on the Dark Knight Commander for their past. The scene with Shasta going against Vecta takes an entirely different meaning when you know how Shasta learned about incarnation and how Gabriel was uncertain towards the mysterious commander because since their first meeting he was able to read everyone's true intentions with perfect accuracy but Shasta's. Again, I will focus on Vixur specifically in this video. There's a reason why he is my favorite character in the entire Alicization arc despite his very short appearance, but there is just so much in these chapters that makes it all feel gut-wrenching rather than, oh god, I didn't see that one coming. And that's exactly what this quote-unquote perfect adaptation lacked. It adapted almost everything, but also threw almost all the weight out of it as well. But yeah, spending so much time before we even head into the episode's contents, I hope that gives you an idea as to why inner monologues are definitely important and why the show don't tell motto is not a blanket statement that can be applied to everything. Some things you just have to tell, and when you don't, what you show loses its meaning entirely. That is what happened in episode 4. The only exception to that is Gabe's past, so let's start with that. I had stated back in episode 3 explained that I would not spoil you his past because episode 4 would surely adapt it, and here we are, episode 4 actually did adapt it as well as it could. I hope you were not spoiled by other creators thinking the anime had skipped it, completely oblivious to the fact that the anime made it very clear it would cover it. The only thing that was skipped here was that it was Alicia's final day with Gabe as she was moving far away with her parents, which caused Gabe to panic and kill her that day instead. It was an important moment for Alicia because she really did want to spend time with Gabe there. She had hugged him, crying that she didn't want to leave at all, and that sentiment was when Gabe decided to fulfill her promise. He didn't take her life there randomly. Despite how much of a sociopath he is, he did have a lot of concerns about his plan to take her life, and those final words of Alicia had reassured Gabe that he was doing the right thing. So he made sure Alicia would never leave, forever to stay in the same spot that dozens of insects had perished in Gabriel's experiments. So I call this scene an exception to the lengthy opening I had today because it did carry over some of Gabe's inner monologue, but it's not a true exception either. As you can recognize now, Alicia wishing that she would never leave this life she had with Gabe changes the meaning of the scene entirely and also puts more context to what happens when she dies. The light Gabriel sees leave Alicia's head is his own imagination, it's nothing else. It's his rationale, his justification of what he just did. The fact that he killed her because she wanted to stay with him forever, so he had simply imagined her soul leaving her body and merging with his instead, binding them together forever and fulfilling her wish completely. What he saw when he killed Lipia was real, but we'll get there in a bit. Of course, this whole justification of a 10-year-old does not make much sense if you're older than 11, but at that moment reality was set for Gabe and he had conducted hundreds of experiments on human souls since then before coming to Ocean Turtle. And yeah, that's why I refer to Gabe as a quote-unquote shonen villain. He has no weight, he has one defining trait, not even an extensive motivation with a variety of justifications. It's that simply he is obsessed with souls. And the build-up from insects to killing a human is too much of a leap in logic that we would be better off without an explanation if you ask me. You see, as fans of fiction, most of us can accept villains with no clear motivations. Joker from DC Comics, not the most recent Joker movie, but the actual Joker, doesn't have a clear driving factor either, but he is one of the best villains in the history of villains. We just accept who he is and are perfectly fine with not having a backstory attached to him because that backstory is covered under suspension of disbelief. If Gabe's backstory was only Alicia and then seeing her soul, that's perfect. I can suspend my disbelief with the idea that, oh, that's just who he is. The problem is that Reiki specifically aimed to explain who he was and got himself into a rabbit hole. If you try to explain the motivation of a sociopath, well, your explanation better stick because by attempting to explain it, you're robbing the audience from the benefit of suspension of disbelief. And oh boy, the random day at the workshop, his father explaining how the nervous system of a bug works and then randomly jumping to the concept of a metaphysical soul rather than the very clear physical explanation. The logical thread kind of breaks there, don't you think? You see, that's what's so great about Kayaba. He is more or less a sociopath as well, depending on how you look at it, but his dream of a floating castle high up in the sky doesn't have a clear inception. He just has that dream for all we know, and the rest is blank, making sure the audience fills the blanks or just completely ignores them instead. That's how our brain works. There is so much unknown related to his vague ideal that instinctively we don't really mind, since the driving factor is that dream and the rest that is not the driving factor doesn't matter. In comparison, Gabe's obsession has an initiation, and once there is information, our brain instinctively analyzes information, and if there isn't a logical linkage in the thread, it just all falls apart and you end up being so much better if you didn't even know. And also, Gabe is just a major shithead that plays into the constant shonen tier power creep in War of Underworld, so there's that. Either way, that was already too long. The 10 lords present themselves to the Emperor. I love the preliminary scene where the leaders are shown gathering up. It really illustrates the leaders and the races incredibly well in short 3-second snippets. Goblins with their slight differences, pugilists excited for a brawl, assassins with their poison preparation table, etc. Very cool addition there. But the actual meetup scene is where the anime loses track of what is important again. In that scene, none of the leaders are important at all. That scene is all about Gabriel's perception of each leader of the 10 races as he evaluates them one by one. The anime showcases everything that is visibly happening perfectly, all the way to the individual quirks of the leaders and the cheering of the races, all the way to DIL having an additional line to impress the Emperor, but that was never the point of the scene. It was about how Gabriel was not interested at all in the non-human looking races as well as the merchants, how he analyzed the assassin leader to barely show any sign of weakness despite his weak physique, how the chief of the orcs, Lipia, despite his appearance, beautiful for an orc as they say, had eyes that gleamed with intelligence, how he was caught off guard by Iskan announcing himself as the 10th champion of the Pugilist Guild, making him think how some brawlers can ever be useful in battle of magic and swords, how carefully he analyzed DIL to instantly realize she was incredibly calculated in her actions, so much so that despite her longer introduction, Gabe had realized she had more to say but decided not to, leading him to respect Dee for making the perfect call, an introduction that is more impressive than others but not overstaying its welcome either. I mean, they specifically included this nod as a detail. The problem is, he had waited a moment before nodding to judge if Dee would recognize he was not at all interested in her attempts of seduction, which Dee had indeed recognized and kneeled instead of continuing her speech. Like, if you include a detail, maybe include all of that detail. And then there was Shasta's introduction. That was a tense moment for both Shasta and Gabriel, as the knight had remained silent for a bit before introducing himself, but only looking at Gabriel to ask why he had returned as Emperor. Naturally, knowing it's a VR game at its core, Gabe had embraced the Emperor role and put up an act, and I'll give them that much. They did show Gabe realizing Shasta was not shouting and yelling like the other races, albeit a little downgraded. Shasta, the entire scene, remained kneeling the entire time. That caused Gabe to get really concerned because for once, that was a being that he simply could not read the intentions of. I'll quickly interject here because so many people ask me about it, how Gabe was able to contact outside when Underworld was supposed to be running at 1000x the speed. I thought the anime made it very clear, but it doesn't hurt to briefly mention it, especially if so many people are asking. When Gabe goes to the console to contact Critter, you see a confirmation window pop up, and it's the same window that Kirito got back in episode 24, asking for confirmation to reduce the FLA back to 1, and you can see the warping effect they use to highlight the FLA change when the conversation begins and then when it ends. But yeah, the scene that follows is Vecta versus Lipia, and even before that scene begins, there's a problem. You see, in the light novels, Gabe had never seen Lipia's face or hair before, so he was fooled for a little bit at least, until he caught on to some hints that the woman was not an escort, which I'll elaborate shortly, but this is completely invalidated in the anime by the fact that the anime simply portrayed Lipia right there next to Shasta. I mean, Lipia was no tactical genius trying to assassinate a god with a lousy makeup, but she at least was not foolish enough to show her face to the Emperor and then put a lousy makeup on. I mean, for fuck's sake, she didn't even have a different hairstyle than what she had at the ceremony. And once again, while the scene is intense, with the lack of inner monologues, how Gabe slowly figures out that the escort is not an escort and starts getting prepared to defend himself is completely skipped. What was also skipped was that Gabriel could easily read Lipia to her core. Lipia was not sent here by the orders of anybody, and Gabe knew she had provided honest answers. And her answers were truly her own. She had grown up in the times where there was no proper peace within the Dark Territory, and this war would just take the Dark Territory years back. While most little girls opted to become Dark Mages, Lipia, with her sense of justice, had decided to become a Dark Knight instead to become more powerful, all the while taking care of an orphanage in the Dark Territory that she was running so the children of the Dark Territory would not live through what she had lived through. But then there was another key detail. Lem Manolo, a subscriber, had a wonderful comment under one of my posts highlighting this aspect as well as some other things before I had even started working on this video, so a shout out is necessary, I believe. But the thing is, much like the Human Empire citizens, Dark Territory citizens also cannot break rules. The difference is that Dark Territory only has a single rule: take everything with strength. So the rule effectively dictates a clearly defined strength structure, turns the citizens into obedient members, whereas if there is unclarity in a direct strength comparison, you fight and attempt to rebel. The results of the rebellion of course shapes the strength structure afterwards depending on who wins, and that is why Lipia can actively try to assassinate Emperor Vecta here. She truly believes Shasta is a stronger entity than the Emperor, since not a single action of the Emperor was seen so far by anybody, and to be frank, even hypothetically, she's not wrong either. If we completely disregard the special abilities of the God account, which I won't spoil at the moment, I'll only hint at it at the end of this video because the novels hint at it as well, Shasta is arguably more powerful than Gabriel if we consider the circumstances of Underworld. So she chooses to follow the ideals of Vixur instead of bowing to the ideals of the Emperor because she believes the Emperor to be inferior. But yeah, despite all the missing stuff, this scene is perfectly animated in my opinion. And it is critical as well because the anime very clearly depicts that Gabriel does not have any sexual desires in the scene, nor does he particularly enjoy killing. Just look at his face. It is completely calm and focused. He doesn't have a murder fetish or anything. All he is interested in are the souls, which the following scene makes very clear. And yeah, just to add, as mentioned, the soul he saw as a child was his imagination, however the soul he sees rising from Lipia is not his imagination, and that is your first hint towards the special abilities of the Emperor Vecta account. Just one single complaint for the entire anime industry for that matter: please ditch your evil antagonist template faces. People are not idiots. They can understand someone who just murdered an idealistic woman and devoured his soul, flashbacking into the time he killed his childhood friend, is probably a bad person. We don't need these fetishist faces to make the connection. Then he brings Lipia's head, Shasta gets triggered, he starts using incarnation, Fuza interjects, he goes full incarnate and devours the 3 nearby leaders and then gets devoured by Vecta instead. That's what happens if you're an anime only audience. Now let's go deeper into the light novels and start with how Shasta is superior to everybody else in the room and how he learned to use incarnation and where his passion comes from. Mind you, I believe it's fair to put up a quasi-spoiler warning here. About 20% of his backstory has the potential to be included in the next episode. However, since I am certain a majority of it has been lost because all the different perspectives and available people to tell the story or lack thereof, I have decided to go in depth on Shasta's past here, unlike what I did with Gabe's past last week. There I was certain it would get fully adapted, and it did. But with Shasta, well, I believe 20% will definitely get adapted next week. It's such a limited view of the entire story that I decided to cover it fully here instead, regardless of the bit that I think will be adapted next week. You can skip this if you really want to wait for that 20% of the story to be told by the anime next week, but I advise against skipping. And another thing, from this point onwards, we are going into storytelling mode. I will provide all the details in a narrative way, so please don't expect me to repeat my words to further highlighting things. Everything mentioned here is all information presented as how the story is. I feel like that is necessary to not over convolute things, as there are way too many perspectives to cover and the video is already long as fuck. Shasta was someone who had a rough childhood before he was chosen as a Dark Knight cadet, which shaped his compassionate and idealistic vision similar to Lipia. He was someone who wanted to ensure the children of the Dark Territory would never be the subject of bloodshed and could grow peacefully. Once he was a Dark Knight, the commander of the Knights back then had seen his potential and took him under his wings. And his master was no joke either. He was the one who realized it was impossible for the Dark Territory to fight the human realm unless they properly understood what they were dealing with, the secrets of the Integrity Knights, and his master had taught him well. The ultimate sword technique was what the Dark Knights called the Empty Sword. It was a metaphorical name, of course, that means your sword was not a tool but an extension of your body, so you would fluently act with an empty mind, so to say, without having to think lengthily about your moves, hence the Empty Sword. You would see the action of your enemy and not try to overpower it but circumvent it, try to turn it around. Sounds familiar? Remember when Berkuli compared Yu-Gi-Oh's sword style to that of the Dark Knights, the continuous blade he had called it. The Dark Knight's style, at its core, is what Kirito advertised as the Aincrad style. Watch, adapt, overturn in one fluent movement. While the Dark Knights did have the superior sword style, Integrity Knights had a major equation breaker at their disposal: perfect weapon control and the incarnate arms. The knowledge of the Integrity Knights who lived hundreds of years was beyond the comprehension of the Dark Knights who lived until their 60s at most and never properly passed down their teachings. But Shasta's master was wiser than that. He knew he had endured the commander of the Integrity Knights for the last time, as he had endured a wound via his incarnate arms that had healed in principle, as in the wound was no longer hurting or causing him to lose HP, but the site of the wound was never to be healed due to the incarnation used. With that, he turned to Shasta and teach him what he had learned over the years, and eventually demanded Shasta kill him to inherit all the knowledge and prove that he was now beyond him, as the prodigy must always surpass his master if there is any expectancy of progress. With tears in his eyes, Shasta obeyed his master's wishes with great pain in his heart and defeated him. The only visible outcome of this fight was the similarly never healing cut on his face, but he had learned a whole lot more than what was visible. And he would prove that knowledge against the commander of the Integrity Knights, Berkuli himself, in battle. He remembered the fate of his master, the master who forced his student to kill him off to inherit all the possible knowledge. Shasta knew he wouldn't be able to defeat Berkuli, and he never entered the fight with the intent to kill Berkuli either. Shasta wanted to make sure another Dark Knight would not have to cause bloodshed against his master. Shasta was going to fight to the best of his abilities to stop the unending cycle of bloodshed. And it was the wise commander Berkuli who recognized Shasta was not fighting with the intent to kill. Both gave a good swing with their swords, and Berkuli had to laugh when their swords had properly locked, instead of Shasta being deflected. Shasta remembered the lines Berkuli muttered to him at that moment. "A very good swing. No sword forged of desire to kill could stop my blade that way. Think upon that and come to me again in 5 years' time, boy." 5 years ago that day, the commander shared his respects with Vixur Shasta and for the first time retreated peacefully against the commander of the Dark Knights, their sworn enemies. And over that 5-year period, Shasta had a lot of time to think, to understand, to come to terms with Berkuli and envision peace between the two empires. But then, Emperor Vecta brought forward the head of the traitor, the head of the peaceful future Shasta was looking forward to. At that moment, he knew he wouldn't have a chance to fulfill Berkuli's expectations, to find common ground. The monster had to be destroyed at all costs, so the Dark Territory could have hope for the future. The other lords of the Dark Territory knew what was coming, they were expecting it. Vixur Shasta was a true presence, and they all knew he would try to assume leadership of the entire Dark Territory at a certain time, and they expected a true showcase of power between Shasta and Vecta to decide who they would obey as the most powerful. However, Gabriel, because he didn't see the face of Lipia's lover as clearly as he did in the anime in the memories, was not completely prepared for what was about to follow. He was still unsure of who the quote-unquote authority figure was that the lady escort had looked up to as a superior to himself, the emperor, but had expected the knight to his left to draw his sword. Before he was prepared, however, the cunning leader of the Assassin's Guild showed how perceptive he was by stopping him dead on his tracks, surprising D, who had just grown excited of the prospect of killing off her only equal to exert his power by strength, none of which were really shocking to Gabriel at this point. The poison of Fuza was strong enough to rid Shasta of his perfect weapon control, a showcase of power that was never before seen coming from a member of the Dark Territory. Assassin's Guild was where the cowards of the Dark Territory banded together. Those without any power had to live in fear for their lives, which made them extremely paranoid, but also prepared for every case to ensure their safety. And of course, to exact vengeance of all those years ago, when Fuza had become one of the cadets that Shasta had brutally defeated in his path to authority. Fuza was using the same killing intent on Shasta that Shasta was attempting to use on Emperor Vecta. But there was one major difference. No sword forged of desire to kill could stop my blade, Berkuli had said. In rage, Shasta had forgotten the lesson he had learned 5 years ago momentarily, but the realization was enough to get him back on the track. Gabriel Miller had been watching the events play out carefully until he had realized Shasta's sword completely vanishing into black mist. It was different than the perfect weapon control he had initiated earlier. The mist grew larger and larger into a storm cloud, first enveloping Shasta's entire body and then going wild and destroying the assassin leader and the 2 goblin leaders. The Chancellor of the Dark Mages Guild, despite all her precautions and dozens of protective spells around her that should have stopped all kinds of attacks, had barely escaped the mist, losing one of her legs in the process. For the first time in his life, Gabriel felt shock, he felt fear. The generals were equal in power, so the events in normal cases should have taken a long time as they would chip away each other's life over time, but that was not what happened. Gabriel knew he was facing something he didn't know, he didn't understand. Vasago had already leapt out of the way of the mist long time ago, but Gabriel had watched for too long now to evade the oncoming mist. He knew his sword wouldn't save him either. As a result, all he could do was to wait for the mist to engulf him with no hope of fighting back. Gabriel had given up. Shasta's attack was not a physical one, it was an incarnate attack, thus was taking place in the light cube cluster that hosted the Underworld residents. It wasn't part of the codebase, but due to how the codebase and the main visualizer work in tandem, it had an effect on the world. He hadn't destroyed the HPs of Fuza, Kubiri and Hagashi, he had simply destroyed their data in the light cube cluster, causing them to disappear. He was going to do the same thing to the Emperor as well, but there was a single difference. Gabriel was not a simple light cube, he was a real human diving from an STL. It shouldn't have been too different though in technicality. Kirito was the proof that a real human mind can be affected by incarnation. But when Shasta attempted to destroy Gabriel's floodlight as well, he reached a void. There was no sign of life. It was as if the self-image of his opponent was a giant black hole, something that devoured everything else resembling life. Shasta was the first person to meet the true nature of Gabriel's mentality, the true nature of what Gabriel thought himself to be. Shasta was the first person to meet Subtilizer, the devourer of souls. Back in the normal plane, Gabriel had no idea what was happening in the mist, but he felt his fear turning into joy. If he hadn't lost himself in that joy when he realized he could feel Shasta's data in his mind and kept on fearing for his survival, he knew the STL would destroy his brain. But he was way past that point. It was pure joy he was feeling when he made a note to himself to have Critter investigate the logs of what was actually happening, because he knew what he was feeling was the phenomenon he had been dreaming since his childhood. As the mist cleared around him, Gabriel felt the presence of Shasta's soul weaken and eventually disappear into the void. He had no clue what the fuck he had just endured. Maybe it was an ability of the god account that had saved him, maybe it was something even beyond the system, but he had realized fear meant doom in this world. When the mist had cleared in the room and DIL could see the Emperor smiling on his throne, the authority established by the strongest was clear, and she was the first one to announce her loyalty to the strongest person in the room. Oh my god, that's one hell of a long Alicization explained there. Hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed making it. I just love when there's an opportunity to just go into a proper narrative mode, though it takes a goddamn long time to edit. One last bit I want to mention, I actually wanted to talk about this more in depth, but seeing the length of the script, I'll keep it brief. There are a bunch of people who are talking about how quote-unquote bad Alicization is. A recommendation for all those people. I don't know your justification. I will not try to portray Alicization as enjoyable because that depends on your personal preferences. All I'm gonna say is, why the fuck are you still watching after 28 episodes? Sure, the anime tried to portray SAO since the beginning back in Aincrad as a primarily action show when it never was, and then it became apparent to everyone when the narrative in Alicization finally forced the anime staff into adopting a more narrative over action perspective. But Alicization has been like this since episode 1. I was talking to you since the beginning that Alicization was not an action show, it was a character drama above all else. Why are you still here, after 28 episodes, complaining that you do not enjoy Alicization? A sane person would have simply said, well, I guess this is not for me. After the 5th episode at worst case, what kind of devil is forcing you to keep watching after 28 episodes of exactly this? It's time to leave. If it's not to your enjoyment, maybe you should go listen to the Frozen soundtrack and give the cover song a listen. 28 episodes for God's sake, that is 580 minutes, borderline 10 hours of content you kept putting yourself through just to be able to complain. 2 hours and it should have been clear. Jesus Christ, man, go watch something else for fuck's sake. But yeah, I believe that kind of covers it. Let's keep it short. Next episode is titled The Night Before the Battle, so we are wrapping up Volume 15 Alicization Invading, an episode earlier than we initially thought from the looks of it. We'll get to see the human army lines and reunite with some old characters. Do comment Shrouded Mists of Shasta in the comments to let me know you made it this far. Ask your questions and use hashtag AskGamerturk for weekly War of Underworld Q&A. If your question is spoilery, add a spoiler warning. Subscribe and hit the bell icon for all that and more. Links to the light novels, manga and more are in the description. Channel merch is there as well with a special discount code for patrons and channel members too. So as always, thank you very much for watching. Huge thanks to my patrons and YouTube channel members. And until next time, stay cool.